Hey, welcome back. This is the second seminar in the Sake Brewing Seminar series. We're going to be talking about Yamahai and Kimoto-Kei today. Before we get into that, we just had a really exciting event down in New York out here at Joy of Sake. And I only bring it up because I think there were some really interesting things that came out of it. It's always good to go check out and compare your flavors to other flavors out there and see how things go. Um, it was good to see some of the brewers that made it out. There were some commercial brewers there. There were some home brewers that made it out. I would say Brooklyn Kura did some fun stuff. They had like a live Shizuku going on. I actually helped pour for Islander Sake, Chiaki, Dr. Takahashi, who was just on the last seminar. And they got lovely accolades from people. And every year, people are always asking more and more to the American brewers, or people coming in from outside of Japan, rather, I should say, non-Japanese brewers, where can I buy this? Where do you get this? And I think that's really, really exciting. I think it's a huge endorsement of the quality of sake that's coming up. I did get a chance to see Brooklyn Kura's new space as they're beginning to full-scale production, or at least large-scale production, I should say. Probably going to take some time to ramp up. Grabbed a bottle of Kato's 4th anniversary sake, which is really exciting. We're going to talk with him next month, if I have my calendar right. And let's see. Oh, and grabbed a bottle of Dasai Blue 35, which, if you're unaware, is made with Isbell Farms Yamada Nishiki. This one. So really excited about that. But today, our topic is, of course, the Yamahais and lows of Kimoto-Kei, or the Kimoto brewing system. So let's meet our guest and jump right into this stuff. So let's see here. Our guest today is going to be Byron Stithem of Proper Sake in Nashville, Tennessee. Byron, welcome.
Well, hey there.
How you doing?
I'm pretty good. It's good to see you.
Awesome. Good to see you too. Um, Well, let's see. Let's start off with why don't you give us a little quick introduction of yourself and maybe a little bit of your background and how did you get into sake? How'd you arrive here?
Yeah, so Proper Sake started in 2016, and it really was kind of forced on me because I'd been threatening to do it for so long. My business partner and I had been part of a company called Dinner Lab up until that point, and it went out of business in pretty epic fashion, um, kind of unexpectedly as well. So I filed the paperwork for Proper the next day, and it really was, the kick in the ass that we needed to get started. But prior to that, my background was in culinary science and fermentation, and really all elements of food and beverage. I worked in a lot of craft cocktail bars and worked in a handful of culinary labs, and fell in love with sake when I was living in New York and actually had access to that versus coming from Tennessee where there was very little and still more to come. But yeah, I started this project or dreaming about it, I guess 10 to 15 years ago, depending on how serious you're talking. But
Very cool. I'm going to come join you on screen now, so ask you a couple more questions to get to know you a little bit. You did mention Tennessee. So you're from Tennessee originally, or is there another reason why you really felt compelled to bring it there, knowing that there were obviously other areas in the country might have been better for, consumers and whatnot? What was it about Tennessee that said I got to be here?
yeah, I mean, 100% Tennessee is the last place you should open a sake brewery. And I'm originally from Kansas City, but had moved to Nashville in 2001, I think, to go to college, and had certainly laid some roots here. Like I said, I moved to New York, but um, when we were getting ready to have our kid, we decided New York wasn't going to work anymore. So we moved back to Nashville, where I had a lot of culinary opportunities. And fortunately, over the years, Nashville has actually kind of turned into a real city. I don't know if we're there yet, but we're in the process. And certainly, if was a ghost town that was there when I moved there in the early 2000s, it probably wouldn't have worked. And who knows if it will still, but we at least have a fighting chance.
Well, of course, we wish you the best of luck in that, and I think every location is just starting to have that realization. I mean, heck, even Japanese sake has in the last 10 years been going through a doubling of exports to America. So who knows? Hopefully it is becoming, like I said, at Joy of Sake, people more and more were coming up to the Western brewers and saying, where can I get this? This flavor is great. So I think we're doing something right. We just got to get it out to more people. I was trying to decide which of these questions to drop into next, but we'll start with a somewhat easier one. What's your favorite bottle of sake or brand?
Um, yeah, so we'll get into this more, I guess, as we progress through kind of proper sake's incubation and entree into the market. But really, one of the first sakes that resonated with me, not that all sakes did, but Tadorigawa's Silver Mountain really was the first time I tasted a Yamahai sake that had this level of elegance to it that I found really curious. And from the beginning, really felt like that style of sake would have resonance with the Western markets, and especially coming from the South, where the food can certainly be in your face at all times, if not just super heavy. But yeah, I mean, outside of that, I've always gravitated towards some of the weirder stuff out there, but find myself always moving back towards the center in some form or fashion.
I can relate to the Southern food, having just lived in New Orleans for the last 2 years. Absolutely, it is
A
a
lot of brown
yeah,
items. Yeah.
yeah. You do need something to pair well that has some oomph to it.
Yeah.
Let's see. Um, as a Now you've been a brewer now for some time. Um, is there something that you've learned about the process that kind of changed how you thought about sake brewing? It's kind of a broad question, but suppose that's more of a yeah. I think at the end of the day, it's like what maybe another way of asking this is, what is something you've learned along the way you wished you had known at the beginning?
Yeah, I think if I had had more time to prepare ourselves for the world we were getting into, it certainly would have meant more commercial size batch testing, which is difficult because yeah, once you get started, it's hard to stop, and certainly once you're getting your licensure, um, you have to have all of those elements in place. So it's not like you just have a free place to mess around. So growing into commercial size production was certainly a challenge and something that I continue to deal with every day. But I mean, outside of that, I think I started pretty hard in the paint on some of the more challenging sake styles, and
Mm,
certainly as we've continued to grow, like I said, we've certainly come back more towards the middle, but obviously spent a lot of time in the Yamaha and Kimoto world. Uh, it took me a minute to figure out that not everybody else is ready to be challenged quite as much as I am, palate wise. So yeah, finding that happy medium was something that I certainly wish we had more market research, more market data, and then more knowledge of the distribution market in general. Distribution sucks. I don't think anybody that I've met in the manufacturing world has a favorable lens on that. So,
certainly not. No.
uh, you know, find me offline if you know something I don't. But yeah, working with distributors is challenging. It's a system that's somewhat rigged against you as a manufacturer, but even more so if you're doing something that's super niche and requires a little bit more hand holding.
Mm,
So that's been a challenge and something that we continue to try and work through different angles. But yeah.
mm. Yeah, these are all big, big, big questions that need to be given better answers than we've gotten so far. So
That's right.
thanks for sticking through it. And hopefully today we're gonna give some people at least some head start in terms of the things they should look forward to, right? And kind of help them kind of think about it, at least get a better mindset going into something that is much more complex, Yamahai, Kimoto in that sense. So we really appreciate that. Well, and with that, why don't we jump right in? And we're obviously going to have time for questions at the end. I have tried to record the ones you've already submitted, so that we're in a good place to answer them. But if everyone could drop them into the live chat, and if you've already pasted into Discord, that's fine. If I don't get it to it right away, it might be because my computer's freezing and I can't see it. So repaste it into the chat, and I'll try to get it. Great. Well, let's get started, Byron. I'm going to throw you up here, and you can take it away. All right?
Okay. So, like I was mentioning, as we've been sort of trying to figure out who we are as a brewery and what it is that we're should be known for, or what our corner of the market can be, I really have come back to some cross section or nexus of elegance and complexity. And so, when I'm thinking about recipes or concepts or flavor profiles, that's usually the framework from where I start. So certainly from a complexity standpoint, the Yamahai, Kimoto, Bodaimoto, pre-modern styles are where I gather most of that particular qualitative associations from. And then the elegant components, trying to work in these ginjo related temperature curves and, ginjo-ka as much as is possible, and really trying to find a balance between those. And that's, like I was saying with Todorigawa, Silver Mountain, I think it is quintessential in that particular regard. The way that they've been able to make a marketable sake that I think is so approachable for so many people, and also especially with the Western market has such a unique characteristic to it. It's really those styles of sake that have been really influential in what we do. So when we were first starting, these are a handful of the breweries that I felt a certain bond connection towards, and would, be able to go on to either visit or apprentice. And as we were kind of building our initial recipes, the thought process was around like, what are the common threads here? What is it about these sakes that I like, both from a flavor perspective? Do I think that they would work in the Western market? And as far as production technique goes, what are some of the common themes amongst them? So obviously, if you know any of these breweries, you know that they all do some pretty heavy Yamahai and Kimoto production. But the other thing that I figured out after some searching was that these are all breweries that have relatively hard water, for at least by Japanese standards. So pretty much everyone on this list is coming from water supplies that are above 10 DH. And I think back to those notions around what the Western market would be interested in, or would be more pairable with Western cuisine. There's a minerality, I think, that comes from certain sakes like that. And I've also always been a fan of some of your more mineral forward white wines, especially when it comes to food and pairing in that regard. Just having that extra layer of earthiness. There's texturally something that you get, but beyond that, the fermentations, tend to be obviously more vigorous. And so, yeah, you combine this particular water profile. You've got pre-modern Shubo styles, and then a lot of these you have, sort of modern Moromi techniques with very long, low, slow temperature curves, and Ginjo related Koji production. So whether some of these breweries read as particularly elegant or not, you can certainly see that aspect in their brewing. And certainly you can find products in their product mix that are a little more elegant than others. So again, this is kind of my recipe starting or jumping off point when I'm thinking about how to build a sake that will hopefully meet my needs or my aims when I'm trying to build a sake that's really great for Western cuisine. And again, the South being probably a little bit harder to pair. Even some of our higher end restaurants probably tend to be a little bit more flavor bomby than some of your other fine dining restaurants. But yeah, so when you're looking for elegant components, I'm always thinking about the type of rice, the mill rate, modern yeasts, obviously, the Ginjo temperature curve, how long and how slow, what's your max temperature going to be, Koji production, Tsukihaze versus Sohaze, the water ratio, obviously the longer you want to ferment, you're going to want a higher water ratio and a slower ferment. Of course, that also lends to a little bit more elegance or nuance. And then the water profile. So for the most part, we use pretty hard water profiles, but on occasion, if that is something I'm trying to lean more into, pulling some of that mineral content out is one mechanism or one lever to pull to get to where we can get a more subtle profile. And then, of course, on the complex side, you've got your pre-modern shubos, you've got table rice or non-sake rice, higher ratios of Koji to Kakamai. What bacterial cultures are you introducing or inoculating? Indigenous and wild yeasts. We try and keep a bank of what would be considered non-sake yeast that can ferment at relatively low temperature around to work with. And then the water profile again. So messing around with different aspects of hard water and looking at these different regions, especially in Japan, because even amongst those high mineral content areas, the rock formation and water profile is still very different. Oh, well, it looks like the temperature curve charts here didn't show up, so that's not good. Well, they were on there earlier. You'll have to take my word for it. We can add those later if people are interested. But essentially, I have on this page two different temperature curves, and the gist of it is, and I'm sure most of you, if you've looked into this at all, have seen a Yamahai and Kimoto temperature curve. The real difference is the Kimoto is going to start at a little bit lower temperature, at least, and again, this should all be taken with many grains of salt and rice, but everything that I'm doing is not necessarily the right way to do it, but it is the best of the information I've been able to accrue over the years. And I was just lamenting to Lucas earlier, I always wish I had more data and am a one-man show, so everything that we do is entirely produced and packaged by myself, at least at this point. So there are times when maybe data or quantitative research has to be one of the items that is not attended to as heavily. But again, you're looking at roughly a 30-day starter for either of these. And for the Kimoto, starting in the 6 to 8 degrees Celsius range, the Yamahai starting around the 10 and then dropping down to a 6. Day 3 or so is usually where the saltpeter is added. So basically, this is where you are squelching denitrifying bacteria. And I always do it for Kimoto. Sometimes I do it for Yamahai, sometimes I don't. But the curve will then, of course, ratchet up a degree at a time once you reach a certain day. And then the 13 to 17, day 13 to 17 is usually where the yeast is added. And the main thing that I'm looking for is just making sure my alcohol stays under 10% so it doesn't start to kill itself, and then making sure that the yeast isn't added before the pH is below 4. So yeah, the other real difference in our starters here is that the Kimoto starter has a slightly lower water content. The Yamahai has a slightly higher water content, and of course this is what mitigates some of the extra macerating and hand wringing, as it were. So a lot of what we do, especially for our broader market products, is going to be hot Yamahai. And so you can see here the ratios that we use for that. I have really fallen in love with the hot Yamahai techniques over the last several years, partially because being a one-man band means that my time is incredibly limited, but the relative control and um, qualitative data that can be collected around different lactobacillus sources and cultures has been really interesting to me. And you can really isolate it in a way that allows you to fully control for the lactobacillus and the lactic acid resulting from that, but also without a lot of other potential microbial additions that would maybe make that data harder to collect or taste. So this is essentially just Koan Toka Shubo, but with an extra day where you are dropping the pH. So the first day, essentially hot strike water, where you are dropping your Koji in so that you can extract enzyme content. And once the rice is finished steaming, it goes directly into the tank, so it's not cooled at all. So that steamed rice will, if you get your temperatures right, continue to hold at 55°C. And then our brewery is kept at about 40 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit. So over the next few hours, the temperature will continue to drop. And once it gets to 35°C is where I'll add my lactobacillus culture. Typically, there are some cultures that prefer maybe a slightly higher or lower temperature, but for the most part, 35°C is a really good active area for that. And so then that first day, you're essentially just macerating and letting the lactobacillus take over and produce lactic acid. And then the next day, if your temperature is right and your pH is low enough, again below 4, that's when I'll make the yeast addition. And then from there, you're essentially just letting the natural temperature of the facility continue to bring your temperature down until your first day of additions. So yeah, sorry again about the missing charts on the previous slide, but hopefully there's enough information there, and I'm sure Lucas can send out a follow-up with those. They're not particularly interesting. I'm sure you've seen this particular chart before, but
Do you mind describing them to us, just in terms of just so people have a mental image for the purposes of right now, in terms of typically what the courses are that you would follow, or is that something that you don't have memorized? It's fine if you don't.
No. It's it's essentially, if you were to look at this chart for the hot Yamahai, I have obviously your day, your operation, your temperature, and then the pH that you've taken and the alcohol content. And those are usually the ones that I'm paying the most attention to. So again, day 3 really is where you're going to want to add your saltpeter to mitigate denitrifying bacteria if you're doing a Kimoto. If you are doing a Yamahai, at least in my situation, sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. It just depends on whether I'm trying to let a more vibrant and wild microbial environment take over, or if I'm trying to keep it somewhat more dialed in. Again, the elegance versus complexity kind of components of the brew. And then, it really from there, the temperature curve is continuing to go up a day at a time until you get to a pH that's acceptable for the addition of your yeast. And for me, again, that's usually between day 13 and 17. And then from there, you're just trying to bring that yeast culture up to a viable quantity for full pitching. Does that answer the question at all, Lucas?
I think so. There's something you asked. You mentioned earlier about the water hardness you have. I think there's often a confusion that exists about, especially for people that are just getting started in this. Do you use, or should I just ask, when you're choosing your water source, what kind of things should people be looking for so that they know they actually can achieve this? In other words, that there's actually bacteria that may even exist in their water.
Yeah. So this is something I totally glossed right over, because I don't think much about our water source because everything that comes into the building gets filtered and then goes through a reverse osmosis. So essentially the water that's coming off of our machine or our taps is zeroed out. So from there, I get to start with a blank canvas and add mineral content back in. So that's trickier for home brewers, but I would say, charcoal filtration is certainly not out of reach, and you can go to Home Depot and get any sort of charcoal filtration rig. You're going to want to drink that water anyways, so don't short yourself on good water. But yeah, I mean, the closer you can get that water to a neutral starting place, the more flexibility you certainly have with your production styles. And back to Nashville not being a great place for sake brewing, but the place that I ended up, the municipal water here is not great. So it was inevitable that I would have to zero the water out anyways.
That makes sense. I think there's a piece of this. So you're adding in cultures early on. I know you had talked about adding in the nitrogen. Sorry, is it nitrogen phosphate? You mentioned. My brain is
Yeah.
just failing me right now.
Yeah, sorry. Nitrogen phosphate.
Yeah.
But yeah, as far as mineral content goes, your usual magnesium, potassium, calcium, those are the big ones that are typically found in rock formations and in harder water. So, and you can look at one side of Japan and see totally different rock formation and water content because of that, versus the southern side is going to have a totally different rock feature that creates different waters. And in certain regions, they're getting water from river sources or water wells, but there's any number of permutations to look at. And certainly you can look at hard water sources from outside of Japan as well if you want to experiment, which we do from time to time. But
I think for people just getting started in it, obviously the water reports really help, right? To find out if they're going to have iron or other things that are going to be in there that are just manganese, right? Things that they're totally just not going to want in there.
yeah,
I think for people that are curious about natural occurring sources, definitely got to make sure you look up the sort of nitrogen cycle and how that kind of plays into your water source. There's a really good chance that if you have city water and it's been purified, that a lot of the bacteria you'd hope to have in there may not be present. Whereas if you're
right.
getting water from a well in Japan, there are obviously places where that's going to be a lot better off. So, and a lot of you will have to end up doing essentially as Byron's doing, which is to sort of start from zero and work up. So you get your phosphates and your nitrates from essentially adding them, and there's no shame in that at all. Just in case people go in these super like old school quote unquote, it's not really that. In fact, in Japan, this is practiced a lot now. Because of all the runoff from farms and other things, or just in industry. So making sure your water is clean. There's one safety issue to throw in here, is that you really shouldn't be consuming nitrates directly. So one thing you can look up, I think it's called nitrous amine. You're going to want to avoid any kind of intake early on. So I don't know actually, Byron, what your process. I know you do a lot of sensory, and I'm sure you're just looking for that pH first before you dive in there and do anything. But actually, that pH drop is probably when people can start being sure it's safe to actually taste their shubo. Before that, you will be theoretically uh, tasting and consuming nitrates, which can lead to this nitrous amine. I'm totally getting the word wrong, but it can actually react in your stomach and cause cancer. So don't do that. We're always
Yeah,
trying to
don't do
avoid people getting cancer. It's a horrible thing. Um, but yeah, so I want to make sure that was called out on this. Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
So let's go to a couple of these questions. Is that all right? Are you at the kind of the Did I cut you off midway through here?
No. I think we're ready to keep moving.
So, um, it might be helpful for people to have this up. It's just kind of a good guide. We can talk a few questions while we're doing this. Let's see. So we have a whole boatload of these things. And when you're going through it qualitatively or quantitatively, um, what are you actually looking for throughout your ferment that is giving you, especially when you get into um, the actual like Moromi side, and you're now growing this up, and that may be something we didn't even really touch on. But okay, so Yamahai gets us to the fermentation or to the Shikomi. Past Shikomi, when you start working with this, there's obviously, are you using a very similar temperature curve that you would use in Sokujo, or are you doing something that's more tailored to your specific, like to Yamahai?
Yeah. So typically speaking, at least for some of our larger production items, the Moromi curve essentially mimics a traditional Sokujo Ginjo curve. So, long, slow, max temp is typically no more than 11, 10 or 11 even, depending on what I'm doing. Um, and a lot of the mainstream production that I do is with the number 7 yeast because it is relatively infallible and it works really well with Yamahai production. Um, I've certainly had some batches that were super sluggish because we were using ambient yeast, or maybe the pitch level wasn't adequate. And this is just a lot of trial and error, but also, like you mentioned, qualitative assessment. And a super, again, being the only employee, really pretty low tech brewery, um, for financial reasons. So, most of what I can do is really just try and make sure that my alcohol content's in bounds, my pH, and then of course your gravity, which plays back into the alcohol as well. But uh, there are any number of metrics that are pretty dialed in when I'm using number 7. It can be a bit of a free for all if I'm using something I'm not as familiar with,
Mm.
especially when you get into wild stuff. Um, and as far as like acid content, I have a few different labs in town that I work with. If I need to get some more dialed in information on microbe content and you know special acidity assessments and whatnot, but considering they're not on site, maybe I get to use them a couple times throughout the life cycle of a brew.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, that doesn't really answer the question, but for the
No, I
most
think
part,
I think to some degree. I mean, like we talked. You gave us a lot of the quantitative. From the qualitative perspective, as you're going through it and kind of tasting it and whatnot, are there things that you pick up on? Let's start with in the actual Yamahai moto, and then maybe go through to the final. Like, what are you looking for sense from sensory perspective as you're going through it and tasting it to say, okay, that's feels like where I want it to be, and how do you know that maybe it's straying where I don't want it to be, or potentially?
yeah, I mean, so visually, the number 7 that I use is very foaming. So you can certainly gather a lot of data from that as to the health of the
Sure.
ferment. And so, of course, spent a lot of time cleaning the side of the tank for the first, week and a half or so. Um, but I prefer to use the foaming number 7 because, well, this particular one that I have in house is specifically Yamahai adjacent, so works really well. But again, being able to see how things are moving along is really helpful, especially when you don't have all of the data readily available or all of the measurement tools right on site. Um, so that's a big one. Aroma is another one that I spend a lot of time trying to understand and figure out at which stage. And like this particular yeast that we use certainly goes through this. this life cycle of cotton candy and licorice and citrus in some regards. And then the finish is almost like tart cherry. Both tart cherry is not a particularly aromatic fruit, but certainly the taste along the way. There are some similar acid components that you would find in this that you might find in that, and so those are when I'm tasting some things that I'm looking for. It's hard to taste a superactive ferment as a qualitative piece of data sometimes because it's kicking off so much CO2
Yeah.
that even after you've left it out overnight, to strain, it still has that very, I mean, of course, on top of that, you have paper taste, but it'll still be ripping off CO2 in a way that makes it, you get to the end of the batch and you're like, God, I hope this tastes good once it settles down. You just kind of have to trust that it will. And so far, things usually settle out.
Yeah. In terms of that active ferment, when it does get going, are you finding yourself like placing a cover over your tanks? Like I know in large tanks you rarely have to worry about it, but in smaller tanks between like 1,000, especially below 1,000, but like 1,000 to 2,000, as Chiaki was talking about last month, you know,
Yeah.
we're worried about oxidation. Do you find yourself worried about oxidation, or have you actually noticed it like part of your process?
Yeah. I certainly early in the ferment will leave the tank somewhat uncovered.
Mm,
Because I want to make sure that there is an oxygen component. But I'm never really that worried about oxidation from a flavor perspective, and that even includes finished product. Um, I think that is something that's also interesting about Yamahai and Kimoto that again drew me to this style of sake for not just the flavor reasons, but the kind of durability and shelf stability components.
mm,
Um, I even find that there are some kind of synonymous qualities with other oxidized beverages that I find these styles of sake kind of age into as well. So
mm.
we certainly reserve as much as I can, given my minimal footprint space wise, for aging purposes as well. And I know that's not necessarily for everyone, but I do think there's a reasonable amount of people, especially in the U.S., that do like challenging beverages, and
Sure.
aged sake, oxidized sake have certain components again that are kind of synonymous with other beverages that people do understand and like, especially in the culinary community. So yeah, I don't spend a whole lot of time worried about oxidation.
Okay. You mentioned storage, and I think this is an excellent time to bring up a question I saw earlier, which was, um, are you finding that cold or warm environments have a lot of effect either way on what you're producing? Obviously, Yamahai and Kimoto are their own beast, out there in the world. So,
Yeah.
I think a lot of people are curious, like, how should they store it, um, if there's an effect one way or the other?
Do you mean finished product or do you mean
Sorry, yes,
during?
finished product.
Yeah, so finished product, I I'm of two minds on this one because there are certain attributes that I'm looking for in some sakes that I'm not in others. So like our distributed product will be finished and kept as cold as possible. So our tanks can hold at about 5 Celsius. So anything that's going into distribution, just because I want to make sure that it tastes as close to the original finished product as possible, it'll be kept super cold. That said, a lot of our facility is unregulated temperature wise. So I will keep certain things out in the storage space where it can move through the seasons. And I find that, or have been advised by certain senseis in the koshu world, who love to agitate sakes, and age them at uncontrolled ambient temperatures. I think there's a lot of fun things that come from that. Um, so yeah, all that to say, there's some mix of stuff that I keep cold for aging, and some that I keep at pretty jarring temperatures throughout the year, um, which certainly expedites the process. But given the durability and the acid content of Yamahai
Mm.
and Kimoto sakes, I think they're just so much more. They're so much more able to age in that environment. Whereas with some sokujos, I've had some really great aged sokujos before, but I think on the whole, you're risking some weird stuff.
So we didn't talk about this yet, I don't think, but rice polish rate, obviously, Chiaki talked a lot about this in terms of different themes. Now that we're talking about amino acids, the source of those, and how those can affect the ultimate flavor, um,
Mm-hmm.
do you have a preference of like flavors or even polish rates when you go in and you're choosing a rice to say, this has been giving me more of those precursors so I can actually arrive at a flavor that I want? Like, did you play around with different polish rates at first to kind of decide and which rice varieties?
Yeah, absolutely. So with our core line, kind of our flagship products, especially Diplomat, Yamahai, Ginjo. Um, I've moved through various iterations there, and certainly it wasn't always a Ginjo, but um, once we really started to dial in on that kind of cross section, I've pretty much done every iteration between 50 and 60% milling to see. Sometimes this is forced on me by what is available, but
Sure.
I'm always happy to test more, especially with different rices, and see. But for the most part, at this point, I've been doing a 60%. Um,
Mm,
I find that some of the 50% that I was doing, and again, this is all different rice varietals too. Um, it's certainly very clean, but for one core product that I'm trying to get out there, I feel like the 60% has just been a little bit more versatile in terms of um, having some more interesting nuances to it, a little more durability, uh, a little more flavor forward uh, component to it. But at the same time, if I had the ability to taste some of the older batches versus current ones
mm,
with 60, I don't know if I'd be able to tell the difference. It's
mm.
it's all a hallucination, really. So
I feel like there's a couple things on here in terms of Yamaha and Kimoto. Just finishing up on that comment, when you were doing Kimoto versus doing Yamaha, did you ever find that there was something you wanted to change about the rice for one or the other? Like, did you find one worked better for one of those styles, just from your own experience?
um, not particularly. There's
Okay.
been I've always been very much trying to work with what the Isbels are able to accommodate without getting myself into any sort of inventory issues. So
Hmm.
um, they've obviously gone through a few iterations of rice, but largely speaking, you know, I've been happy with what I can get from them, and so that usually informs uh, what I'm going to use. But yeah, I'm sure there's some data that I should have been collecting early on that I didn't, but I also just assumed I will be using one of these 3 or 4 rices that I had available, no matter what.
I feel like everyone who's in the place you are in, whereas that means like, there's probably 6 or 7 brewers outside of Japan that were taking these initial steps. I think you all get a huge pass on, like, should I have been writing this down? It's like, I don't even know what to write down.
Yeah.
And obviously there's fermentation in general, but I mean, sake is such a unique fermentation style. Yeah, it's really interesting. I know this actually come up earlier. You said gravity. I know a lot of times we're looking to see, as a comparison to say, am I doing this right? And so a lot of people always ask the questions. Okay, so I'm at the end of my shubo, and I'm about to pitch, essentially pitch your shubo into your dusoe. Um, are there targets that even ranges that you typically shoot for, or think that like when you've seen other people's products? Um, I know there's the last Kimoto that I did, ABV was up around like 12%. The Bombe was somewhere between like 6 and 9, somewhere in that range toward the end. And then I think the acidity was actually like real high. It was also like 10%. It was like a
Yeah.
high percentage. Where do yours kind of fit in that range? Or what would
Um,
you target anyway?
yeah, I mean, those numbers would be pretty accurate for what I would be looking for the main SKUs.
Mm,
Um, Again, sometimes if I'm doing something a little wackier or experimenting with something where I'm trying to build a higher acid environment
sure.
with kind of a broader range of microbes,
Mm,
you can certainly see that acid spike.
sure.
But obviously, yeah, so your Shubo is going to be the most concentrated form of your acid for the whole batch. So you definitely want to see those numbers up there. And especially for a Yamahai.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, as far as alcohol content, it kind of depends. If I'm doing something with number 7, I can usually keep it within under that 10%.
Mm,
And if for some reason it starts to take off, I'll add a little bit more water
yeah.
to make sure. But yeah, there are certainly times too where if I'm doing a smaller run of something for beta test purposes, I may not even get alcohol readings at all. It'll just be totally qualitative. So it's like, do I actually smell alcohol? Am I actually
Sure.
getting
Or
like
taste it.
some
Yeah.
kind of CO2 or ethanol on the nose? And it's like, I'm going to go ahead and just add water.
Okay.
Uh, yeah.
No, that tracks a lot. I think for the main ferment, when you get that going, I think a lot of things come down to obviously individual temperature curves and the style of the type of rice you're using. So it's really hard to like pin down anything in a particular sense. But you said you were shooting for like a 25-day ferment, or somewhere in that like longer Ginjo style. Sorry, you didn't say
Yeah,
the days. I just think
I
25
didn't.
days
I
when I think
should have.
Ginjo. No, no,
Yeah,
no.
I
You
mean, I'm usually actually going into somewhere between 30 and 40.
Oh wow.
Um, it just depends what the desired end result is, but I'm
Yeah,
usually looking for something a little bit drier.
yeah.
Um, and again, like to kind of hit that balance between mineral content and acidity and dryness. Like I'll I rarely I wouldn't say rarely. I do dilute sometimes on the back end, but um, I think a more full alcohol sake is again more parable. Is it maybe going to be as quaffable or as um, high volume for somebody? Probably not. But I think typically speaking, for me, my preference is that extra alcohol content
Mm,
is really valuable for pairing with cuisine as well.
mm,
Because alcohol is a flavor enhancer. It is the thing that is pulling out somewhat lost nuances, aromas, and flavors. And so maybe it doesn't matter that there's extra, but I do think like a punchier beverage uh, does a better job of punctuating food as well.
mm.
That said, I mean, we do some lower ABV stuff too, and sometimes that's just by accident because I'm using a yeast that is maybe not as viable. Um, so certainly, I've done some stuff recently that is only finishing at like 13 or 14%
Mm.
all in, and from there, you just have to let people know like it's going to be sweeter. And in the South, I guess that's not a problem usually, but I find that those are less versatile sakes.
Yeah, I think the whole world of commercial production is a beast unto itself, of just sort of saying, sure, we prefer to have this, but
Yeah.
this happened, and now we need to figure out what to do with it. And that is like every brewer I've ever spoken to, right? That's no one in particular. I don't think I've ever met someone that says, yeah, it just kind of goes well, never sweat
No,
it.
nothing goes
Um,
well.
I know for us at Wetlands, that was never the deal. And every brewer I've worked with since, it's the same deal. So, um, yeah. Let's see here. There's so many different places to take this. We talked a little bit about you do some Kimoto. For people that are thinking of getting into this, and I'll throw this in only because I love little nerdy things, and I know I told you I have some early history stuff. So I do think it's always important because a lot of times we hear home brewers mention this, and I would even say I heard commercial brewers mention this as well, who've been in it for a while, who want to get into Kimoto and Yamahai, and it sort of occupies this space of like, there's a specific way to do it. There's like an old original way, like yeah, Kimoto's the original way, and I think it's important to note that like there is a history of this, and even the word Kimoto is a relatively new word that um, prior to sort of getting into other forms of Shubo, you kind of had Bodai Moto, right? Like really, really old school. But Kimoto originally was known as Kanmoto because it was like cold temps, right? Like the original temperatures, like 6 to 8, as Byron said. And when they started figuring out there is a warm temperature version. I think it's either called Nimoto, I think it is. And those when they started coming up with like a more when they started realizing Kimoto, what's just regular moto was sorry when Kanmoto was seen as more reliable than Bodai moto and some of the other warmer ones. That's when they decided to call it um, uh, uh, sorry what's the word, like Futsuma. It was called Futsumoto, and Kimoto became this thing where it was like the original moto. That's when like Yamahai started becoming a thing. So it was like as these names kept on going, we had to kind of rename things because people started. Sorry, it wasn't when Yamahai. It was in Sokujo. When Sokujo came out, that's when we said, oh, that's the new normal. So we can't call Kimoto Kanmoto anymore. So or sorry, Futsumoto. We had to change these things from which one was called normal. Sorry for butchering that whole thing on a live broadcast, but that's what it is. Um, so yeah, so going from that flow historically, and also for yourself, you were doing Kimoto, and then you were like, all right, now you've gone all the way to like this sort of hybrid approach where you're doing sort of like the high temperature saccharification and as well. For people that are getting into this and thinking, I want to do this super old school all the time, you want to give me why that's maybe not the best course of action at a commercial scale anyway?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the first thing to note is that uh, being a sake brewer for a profession is a horrible, horrible idea, and certainly owning your own brewery even worse so. So, I mean, when you
He doesn't
start
mean that.
there,
He doesn't mean that. He knows.
if if you're starting from that place and then decide just to kneecap yourself entirely again by picking a style of sake that is wildly volatile and misunderstood by the broader market, takes twice as long to make, you know, you just have to be a real glutton for punishment. Uh, or really, really like Kimoto, which I do, unfortunately. So
And there you go.
that that is how we ended up here. But I do think if you are just getting into it, the hot Yamahai style is a really nice way to start and really mitigate some of your potential pitfalls right out of the gate, especially if you're brewing at home where you may not have the most sterile environment, all your best efforts included, but just the higher temperature, the predictability of the actual ingredients being added, you can mitigate a lot of issues that you might run into. That said, there are some fun things that come from having a wild environment, and certainly you look at places like Torada Honke and Tamagawa where they've really embraced the decades, centuries of nonsense that's been collecting on their walls, and it makes for something that's super interesting. Um, and again, back to the original slide that I put up there, one of them, those are definitely on my heroes list and inspirations, to be sure. But yeah, I mean, when you're starting from 2016 and not, the year 16, it's like, well, I haven't had a lifetime and then
Mm,
some to collect these wild cultures. So
mm.
I digress, but
And some of them aren't even present in our location, right?
that's right.
As we talked about, well, actually, I don't know if that made it into Chiaki's talk, but it was one of the talks I gave down at Sake Fest, which was some of the Saccharomyces sake, as it were, or sake, doesn't really exist naturally in North America, and certainly not in Europe. So if it
Yeah,
has made it over here, it's made it over here in smaller numbers, and is not genetically identifiable easily. So there you go, right there. I mean, we're already working from a place where, yes, if you're in the heart of Hyogo or something, this stuff is just flying in the door and
yeah,
latching onto your walls. But we're working with different yeasts, and nothing wrong with that. We just have to figure out how to work with ours. And yeah, they have a 2,000-year head start, sure. But the good thing about that is that realistically, the Japanese weren't even aware of what it specifically was up until about maybe 100 years ago. And so it's more like 100-year start when you take technology into account. And
yeah,
realistically, 2005 is when they sequenced the genome and said, for sure, we know what that is. We know what that is. So now it's up to us to start figuring this stuff out further. But since you mentioned bacterial cultures, people have been curious about the process and when, if you're gonna, like, let's say you succeeded on your first moto, and you're like, all right, I did this, I created something I think hit all the marks. Um, when is a good time for them to capture cultures, store them, if they want to try to revisit that again? Because obviously, once you have success, you're like, ooh, I want to hope I get this again. I think it's probably the one thing that has been mentioned is that, like, unless you're in a brewery that has like a kioke where you're using the wooden barrels and stuff that could store that yeast, or it could be in your rafters, uh, you are not guaranteed to have that restart the same way the next
yeah,
batch. And so
yeah,
obviously for a commercial production to do this, you've really found a great niche there to say, well, why don't we just capture these like any other normal thing? And just to caveat this too, I mean, Akita Kono literally sells the many cultures for this purpose in Japan, of saying, here's a pure culture, go ahead and slap that in at a certain percentage. So when is the best time to sort of take something, store it, and maybe you could talk a little bit about how to reuse those too, like how do you bring them back and say, okay, we got to warm this up the same way you would with yeast, I assume.
yeah. I mean, so we have a lab in town that fortunately has been a great partner in this particular endeavor, and so um, they've been really amenable to collecting samples for us. Um, so, I mean, but typically I will try and get them a sample uh, before yeast is added. So I know early on I collected a bunch just by essentially running starters that would never get yeast additions,
Mm,
and building lactic profiles that way.
mm,
So yeah, my best guess was just where am I going to be at max lactic culture, and typically again when you want your pH to be below a certain number so that you can safely add the yeast, that's usually when I would collect those and take them. And then on top of that, yeah, there's a lot of pure pitch places around the world. So we've been building a larder of different things there, and uh, yeah, our lab propagates those for us. So we're using pure pitches at least when we're doing hot Yamahai starters.
mhm.
Um, the quantity differs depending on how acidic I'm trying to get the mash, but typically um, I'll say for a 3,000 liter tank, um, which we're only filling about 2/3 of the way. So we'll say, a 2,000 liters would be about a 300 milliliter pitch of pure lactobacillus culture.
Okay.
And I've tested that number up and down several times, well, every time really, but um, the resulting total acid and pH levels nominally different.
Okay. That's really great. And I think a lot of people obviously appreciate you being so transparent about your process and how you do this. It's It's a
Again, I would
very
highlight
challenging. Yeah.
every time is a total shit show, crapshoot, and everything I say should be taken with some hesitancy. That's all.
What did
But
you talk a little bit about, just because this is the sort of thing that anyone that's dabbled in this knows. There are shit shows. There are stuff that come up. Can you, like, over the course of time, I imagine you've had your fair share of, like, whoops, or oh no, I forgot to do something and then blank happened. Um, would you have any of those that you can share with us off the top of your head, of like things and moments when you're like, oh boy, and then if you could resolve it, great. And if you're like, hey, word to the wise, you might have to dump a tank because you forgot to do X. I think that's really useful for people to learn, if you have any of them. You might just
yeah.
be the prodigy of
Oh man. I think I've built an environment for myself that allows me to mess up with regularity and be able to still give that to the broader public, but with my hat fully in hand. And uh, so, I mean, if it comes to a distributed product, something that's going to be in the marketplace,
Sure,
there are very specific numbers that I need to hit with that, and there are
sure,
very
sure.
specific protocols for QC. So, I mean, all of that, I've been really fortunate in that I've, been able to systemize everything that I haven't had any issues really. Any day now, I'm sure. But I also, as long as there's not a full bacterial contamination and I think the product is interesting and drinkable, I don't mind some deviation. But again, like there needs to be a baseline for distributed product for me. That said, anything we sell in our bars um, is probably, if it's not one of the mainline products, it'll be a smaller batch that could have done any number of things that were unexpected. And certainly from time to time, that could be underpitching of yeast. It could be, certain wild lactocultures that maybe presented some flavors that some people would find offensive. There's been plenty of that, but I think ultimately being able to uh, directly present people with this sake in a really humble environment, and with a very involved description of the product that they'll be consuming, I think we are granted some leeway in that regard. Um, so I would never put anything out, obviously, that would make anyone sick. And if
Sure.
I thought it was so offensive flavor wise, I would dump it. But it's rare that that happens. And I'm consistently surprised by stuff that I'm disappointed in or was hoping for a different outcome, that somebody will say, that's my new favorite sake. It's
Sure.
like, well, I think you're a lunatic, but thank you for saying that. I guess I will continue to humbly and honestly present this to our bar goers. And so it's a pretty low stakes situation.
Mm,
If people have all the information, or at least a pretty honest interpretation of what they might expect with the sake, then I think uh, you're going to find some willing participants. And so everything on our menu is ranked by elegance to complexity, which is obviously very arbitrary, but it's easy enough to put these in somewhat of a semblance of order there. So people
mm.
can come in and figure out if they're feeling adventurous or not, how far down the list they want to go, or from which end of the list they even want to start.
I cannot wait to visit your brewery. It's been so long and I've been dying. I mean, I've had the ones you distribute, but to be able to go through, I want the weirdest. Just keep going. Um,
Well, come on down.
so there's been a few questions about this as has been going on, of like which specific strains people are looking for and things like that. And I thought I'd give your voice a quick break and say, from a textbook perspective, so that people
Yeah.
know what what you're looking for. Um, there's a few different things right off the bat. So from nitrate reducing bacteria, that's the thing that's actually going to produce your nitrites. Nitrites are what are actually poisonous. They're like there's like an antibacterial property that comes from it. And there's also a moment here where you want to make sure you're not stirring that much. Even if you're doing Kimoto and you're kind of doing your mototsuri, you're not trying to mix it. It's not to like get oxygen in. It's actually get oxygen out. You're trying to like break up this rice, but another piece of that is also you're disturbing the mash so that it's slowly releasing it, because lactic acid bacteria doesn't want oxygen, but more importantly, we want to allow those nitrites to stay nitrites for as long as possible because they're helping to kill off and prevent um, wild yeast from growing. So that's kind of like a piece of protection there that exists. The bacteria that's very natural here is called Pseudomonas, and then Pseudomonas very specifically would be aeruginosa. I want to make sure I can't really pronounce it, but I'll make sure that gets pasted somewhere. Um, and eventually, some of that nitrite can be reoxidized back to nitric oxide. I might be getting that wrong in the full complete part of it, but again, this is all part of that nitrogen cycle. So research the nitrogen cycle if you want to know like why this all works, and you can learn about all the animals that decay and all that fun stuff to lead us to natural fermentation. So then you go into the what's known as homolactic fermentative bacteria. A quick note before we go into this is that there is some debate in the Yamahai Kimoto space as to whether or not you need homolactic fermentative bacteria. These are like your Leuconostoc bacteria, and these are spheroidal, so they're round. By the way, Dr. Chiaki taught me this, so if anyone's wondering, this is where I got a lot of this information. They're very sensitive to nitrite, so they're not gonna. This is why, like a combination of things from the nitrites to the high sugar and the low temperatures, these don't really last beyond a certain pH. They're gonna start producing lactic acid and start getting up, and they're very quick at it. That's the sort of the beneficial piece here. When you start getting the homolactic in, they can produce lactic acid very quickly. The reason why there's a debate in the industry as to whether or not you need them is that if you start with a large enough population of the next piece that takes that, you see that little graph. In my mind, I'm drawing a graph and none of you are seeing it. But in that graph, they always show in the books of like your nitrite reducing bacteria, then it dies. And then you have the homolactic bacteria and it dies. A lot of times they group those together. And it would be useful, I think, if they hadn't, because it's also good to know that there's a rod-shaped bacteria, and that's Lactobacillus sakei with an I on the end, sake with an I. And those are actually resistant to nitrites. So it's not affected by that initial challenge that, of having nitrites that have been produced by your nitrate reducing bacteria. But the thing is, they're slow to produce lactic acid. So if you were to just start with them, you need a large enough population to start so that they can overtake the wild yeast and other gross things you don't want growing. So that way, if you have that three-step process of each of those taking over, that fast homolactic bacteria, or homofermentative is another word that you'll hear, the Leuconostoc, that will get you a pH high enough that all those other bacteria and all the other wild yeast can't live in addition to your nitrites. And then, of course, when you move into the heterolactic bacteria, those are the rod-shaped ones. They're more resistant to the autolysis from nitrites and everything else. But eventually you end up at this point where you've hit that pH you're looking for, which is obviously, as Byron has been saying, somewhere below 4. There's a study that we translated a while back that showed us below 3.5 is like ideal realistically to prevent other stuff growing. And if you go below like 3.2, pretty much nothing's growing other than yeast. So you do really protect it, but to Byron's like statement of balance, you need to know where you want this thing to start off in terms of overall acidity you've generated. So FYI. With all that said, on those basic ones you're looking for, there's obviously other types that add in various flavors, various types of acids, and maybe this is a great place to kick it back and ask, are there some that you have looked for, Byron, that are better than others, or ones that you're like, I've experimented with this, it's a terrible flavor? You don't have to tell us the specific ones if they're secret, but I am kind of curious, were there ones outside of the norm that you identified, your lab plated for you and said, this is some good stuff you got.
Yeah, so I as a personal preference tend to lean towards some that might have more of a citrus profile to them versus a yogurty kind of lactic-y, what you think of when you think of lactic flavor. So there are some that seem to play in both worlds. So almost like you think about like a creamsicle kind of vibe, but uh, but yeah, I mean, for me, anything that's going to highlight, I guess, some more of those white wine characteristics, that's going to play well with minerality, something that has a sharpness and a crispness to it. It really just comes down to personal preference. But yeah, it really, for me, I tend to stay further away from the yogurt, more for the fruit. If
Okay.
we're gonna boil it down.
Yeah, that's really interesting to note. I think I think this is such a wild world. Like really, I mean, not to make it a pun, but like it really is. Like it's such a wild world of trying things out and seeing what you like. I do think it's cool that people could get started and be able to achieve like a Yamahai using the high temp saccharification within such a short amount of time. I did witness a 3 day Shubo once that very much had, I wouldn't call it Yamahai. They do a Sokajo, but the way they did it kind of mirrored a Yamahai in the sense that they let it sit for quite a while it was still in a kind of lukewarm temperature, so bacteria could replicate wildly before they crashed it and added lactic acid. And I thought that was a fascinating, again, somewhere in between where they're kind of finding this. Um, you know, balance of flavor and what they were looking for. But to
Hmm.
have like a 3 day Shubo was obviously something, but you end up with a lot of acid. I mean, it's quite an acidic ferment to the end. So,
Yeah.
um, yeah. You already mentioned the right time to pitch yeast, so we got that. Commercial available sources. Who I know you have your local lab, but you mentioned white labs as well. Are there any other commercial like producers, providers that you've received from or know are good sources for people to get lactobacillus or any other cultures from?
Yeah, I mean, seemingly every yeast lab has their own little selection of lactobacillus, and it's usually, for beard souring. So those are kind of some of the first catalogs I started dipping into before we started really trying to isolate ones that are more specific to glucose. But yeah, Omega has some cool stuff. Um, White Labs, BSI. If anybody else has, any labs that they like, by all means, chip it
Yeah,
into the chat. And if you dig in there and you find some cool stuff, let us know.
very cool. Um, I'm sorry I skipped over this earlier. I should have asked when we were going through it, but better late than never. Someone asked a question about Koji and very specifically, like, what should we be considering when we're picking out our spores? This is such a big question. Everyone emails Higuchi or Akita Kono, and they try to get all the same questions. I always see, oh, I've emailed Higuchi, and Koichi got back to me, and everyone's always sort of like lost when the answer comes back like, well, what are you trying to do? Like, what are you trying to hit? And I think there's that follow up of trying to message back and say, I'm looking to do the following, especially when so much of sake nowadays is talked about in terms of clean and light and all these sokujo, ginjo, daiginjo styles. When it comes to something like Yamahai, where you want the flavor to perhaps be more umami laden or more acidic, there's a challenge here where people just don't even know what to be asking. So starting with like maybe from spore and like what things you might be looking at there, um, and then kind of going into your Koji, what are the kind of things people should be thinking about when they're doing their curves? Considering Chiaki kind of walked us through a little bit of like some of the things regarding Koji, and obviously people can look up in a lot of other places their Koji growth patterns, but yeah, could you talk a little bit about that whole process?
Yeah, I would say that in my experience so far, a lot of those questions, even if you know exactly what you're trying to do, presented to the suppliers of the Koji spore have been pretty unfruitful on my end. I love Koichi, but he's he's not usually super helpful in that department, not for lack of trying, but I guess most of my research or things that I've picked up on are just from visiting different breweries. So all of those breweries that I've visited, um, I certainly have seen any number of their products using the Hakami Ginjo.
Mm.
So I've seen that in every one of those breweries. Not that that's their
Mm.
exclusive,
Sure.
but I guess just by quick assessment, all of those folks have been seemingly happy with how Hakami Ginjo interacts with the Yamahai ferments.
Sure.
So that is predominantly what we use. And as far as like the style of Koji, um, I usually do two different Koji runs for each batch. So one that's going to be for the Shubo and one that's going to be for the Moromi. So a little bit higher spore volume on
Sure.
the first run for the Shubo, a little bit more time in lower temperature phases, and then for the second run, less Koji per kilo, and
Yep.
then trying to really accent the alpha amylase production. Um, so it's a mix, and then I also will generally do more of a sohaze style for the first one, and then we'll lean a little bit more to the sukihaze, so I'll dry the rice out a little bit more.
Mm.
Try and push the sporage in towards the grain as quickly as possible. But
Yeah.
um, that really has more to do with the actual ferment itself and not the starter.
Sure. Sure.
Um, so yeah, I mean, I guess in my experience, and this is mainly just based on guesswork, I guess, but making sure that Koji for the first section is very, very enzymatically available,
Sure.
and again leaning into the beta uh, side of things so that you're not causing too much alcohol production,
Mm.
but or trying to mitigate that. Um, and this could all be totally wrong. I don't know, but it's been
Seems to work.
well, we're making something. I don't know. But yeah, I have seen this kind of technique in most of those spaces that I visited as well in Japan. So
Mm.
there must be something there.
Sure. That's great. I appreciate you walking us through that. I think the whole piece of this here is, we're generating a certain amount of amino acids. There was a question that kind of went to, trying to target more or less umami, but I suppose at that point it just comes back to the same question of Koji in general of like, where are you putting your targets for that later half of especially if you're splitting up your batch into two.
Yeah.
Um, and there was one point on here where I know I mentioned to you during the call, but something Chiaki, sorry, I should call these professional calls. I should call her Dr. Takahashi. She had mentioned to me something that I found fascinating, and I think it really is something that people should be aware of in the distinction between Sokojo and the Kimoto-Kei system, the Kimoto-Kei
Mhm.
Kimoto system, which is that in proteins, when you're in rice, um, you only the only there's two different types of amino acids. You have D and L, and in proteins, the only uh, D protein, swear I'm getting that right. Yeah, D protein, D amino acid is glucine, and that's ultimately where we're getting that umami from, straight. But um, D amino acids tend to present as sweetness. And so when people ask the question, why are we getting a super dry Yamahai, super dry Kimoto, but it tastes sweet? Where's that coming from? Well, um, there is a lactobacillus. So in this case, lactobacillus sake, um, as well as other strains, has a metabolic process that's known as the D-amino acid metabolism system. And what it does is it takes a an amino acid, let's say my hand is an amino acid, and it looks like this in a structure. And then it takes this format and mirrors it. So literally the same exact formula, it's just mirrored. And while there's a lot of chemistry and biology that goes into that description I just gave you at a high level, and thank God for Dr. Takahashi's ability to explain things easily, um, this creates what's called as a D N antinomimer. Pardon my French. And essentially, what that does is it takes your sour, bitter amino acids and it actually can convert them into sweet presenting flavor amino acids. You can look this up in all areas of food science. This is something that has only been recently studied in the last 10, 15 years, and it is a critical piece to why you can achieve fascinating flavor combinations with Yamahai and Kimoto that otherwise would be non-existent unless you were to add pure lactobacillus strains into a sokucho. And at that point, I don't know. I mean, I guess the question is like, where does that line blur? But so it's something to study if you're interested. But this is kind of like what I describe as like Kimoto magic. It's like, why is that happening? And I think that's just fascinating. So wanted to throw that out there before we end. We're coming up on the end here, and I'm looking at like the comments that have been going by here, and there's just so much to track through. We already have so many questions. I feel like this can just keep going on and on and on. So let's see here. I want to find one of these and probably help us wrap it up here and finish out. Um, but I think you've really answered so much of this at this point. So why don't we keep it easy? If anyone else here is a really great one crushing it, otherwise I'm just going to say. Thank you so much for this, Byron. You've really helped us kind of take some big leaps forward here in terms of understanding the process, understanding your process, I should say, and how people might be able to conceptually come at this a little bit differently, knowing that there's all these different options for them. So can't thank you enough. Can't wait to
Yeah,
see you
thank
again.
you guys for having me, and I'm honored. And again, take everything I've said with some level of skepticism, but I'm glad to be here.
Hey, you know what? When someone else comes out of the woodwork and manages to produce a commercial product of this and keep a business going, it will be a great day. And I hope they walk in your door with a bottle and they immediately say, I was able to get here because of you, and I think that's what this is all about. I know we talked about this prior to the call when we were just getting ready, but um, I really think, and I spoke about this at Joyasake with a bunch of people. We just really need to engage a lot of brewers right now to try this, to get out there and build their own local. People need to learn locally what is this, and it does take a lot of I was going to say boots on the ground. It's kind of like an unfortunate term, but it takes a lot of people locally kind of explaining these things. And I think you're doing a huge service to the industry by introducing people to these flavors. I know it's not going to be everyone's cup of tea, obviously, um, but I share the same interest you have. I mean, going to meet Philip Harper and having him tell us, oh yeah, we just leave this stuff out in these natural sort of like climate where it's going from probably -5 Celsius to 30 Celsius plus in the summer, and he's
Yeah.
just like, yeah, we don't do anything to it. But that does have, maybe that is the last question
Yeah.
I didn't ask you, which was, do you pasteurize anything?
So product that goes out to market gets pasteurized once
Okay.
in the bottle. Um, I would at some point like to have an inline exchanger that actually is worth anything, but for the time being, considering what we're doing is a little bit more flavor forward, the single pasteurization is usually good, and the timing usually works. That if it gets shipped, X days after pasteurization, it will hopefully get back to its stasis point by the time it hits somebody's glass.
Sure. Are you
Just given
pretty
the
quick on like ship, like finish, press, ship, or do you actually have it sit for any amount of time? Considering
um,
I've heard
I,
wide ranges from people, so
yeah. It depends on the style of sake, but I find that our main stuff, I really prefer that it sits for a few months before it goes
yeah.
out. So,
All
yeah.
right.
typically speaking, if I can do that, I will.
Well, you've been sitting for us for a while, so I appreciate it, and we're going to let you get off this call. We are just about to hit 1 hour and 30 minutes. Crushed it.
We're
Thank you so much.
pasteurized.
Yeah, we're pasteurized. Um, Thank you, Byron. Look forward to coming to visit you, and yeah, I hope everyone has a chance to go visit you as well and see what you just, especially try your unpasteurized stuff. Boy, I'd love to do that. So I'll come by.
Yeah,
Thank you
come
so
on
much.
down. Thanks,
All right.
guys.
All right. Thank you, everyone. And while Byron's, I'm gonna put this back on me so he can go do his thing. Um, so we're gonna have two more come up. You'll have the end slide in a second. We have Shinobu coming up next month. Going to be talking about how Kato's sake works, and I think it's a really great opportunity for us to see how he built a brewery in Brooklyn, and a very small footprint, and how he's managed to scale that up. And he'll talk us through some stuff. And then also after that, we're going to be talking with Brandon at Brooklyn Kura. And then there's a whole list of awesome people coming up over the next several months. And I guess I just got to figure out how long I can keep doing these things, Corey. I lose my mind. So y'all have a great afternoon, evening for you in Europe, and good morning to everyone over in Japan. All right, take care.